tem. Todo mundo é assim. Já acabou, já?
So you started with the law firm founded by the first, if I'm not wrong. I choose what part.
Boa noite a todos. Sejam bem-vindos. Estão todos me ouvindo? Estão ouvindo daí? Estão ouvindo bem? Hoje nós temos um grande evento organizado pelo professor Rodolfo. Já chamo para participar aqui com a gente. E a Andrea Hoffman também. Hoje nós vamos receber o professor Paolo Carozza. Buonasera. Buonasera a tutti. Então, nós temos uma grande alegria, um grande orgulho de receber esse evento hoje aqui, organizado pelo professor Rodolfo, que muito vai trazer, né, mais conhecimento ainda. O professor Paolo vai falar para a gente aqui. Até tive a curiosidade, né? Você nasceu lá na Itália? Ele não, nasceu nos Estados Unidos, né, professor? Mas eu amo a língua italiana, eu sempre falo isso, e por mim seria italiano aqui, mas tudo bem. Bem-vindo a todos e que a nossa noite seja bem especial.
Obrigado. Então, boa noite a todos. É com muita alegria que a gente dá início a esse seminário. Né? A gente, de forma muito alegre e honrada, né, recebemos o professor Paolo Carozza, né, a doutora Andrea e todos os apoiadores também aqui do evento, né, representados pela figura do professor Gaban, que está aqui também no auditório. Esse evento ele realmente é uma iniciativa, né, que a faculdade está realizando. Né, o Laboratório de Estudos de Transformação Digital é um grupo de estudos que foi fundado aqui na faculdade no ano de 2000, né, que teve durante 2 anos atuou, né, de forma permanente. Acabou tendo a sua atividade suspensa, a gente vai retomar e considero, inclusive, que esse evento aqui ele é uma reinauguração, né, do laboratório, né, que, em conjunto com o Brasil Law and Liberty Society, né, que é uma associação recém-criada, que tem um papel importante, né, de, entre outras coisas, né, promover o debate sobre o Estado Democrático de Direito. Né, André, apenas isso. Nós temos exatamente a ideia, então, de, em parceria, né, com o BLLS, a gente retomar as discussões do grupo de pesquisa, em que todos aqui serão convidados, a gente vai comunicar, vai informar a comunidade acadêmica pelas vias, né, que nós temos utilizados aí, com relação a eventos e tudo mais. Tá? Mas, sem delongas, tá, eu vou passar aqui a palavra, então, para a Andrea, que vai falar um pouquinho sobre o Brasil Law and Liberty Society, tá? E depois passaremos aqui para uma fala inicial do professor Paolo. E só para a gente, até para poder organizar aqui os trabalhos, né, o que nós vamos ter, a dinâmica. O professor Paolo vai ter uma fala inicial de uns 15 minutos, tá? E, na sequência, a gente tem algumas questões que foram discutidas, que a gente vai trazer para ele, questões que tratam, né, sobre liberdade de expressão, sobre o papel, né, que ele exerce no Comitê de Supervisão da Meta, né, questões relacionadas a direitos humanos de forma geral. Tá? E depois também a gente vai abrir oportunidade, né, para receber algumas questões aqui de vocês. Tá? Então, eu vou pedir para vocês procurarem, né, levantarem a mão à medida, né, que o evento for acontecendo, que a Camille vai poder passar para vocês um papel com a caneta, vocês colocarem a questão. Aí eu peço, né, colocar o nome, né, o nome e a questão, que a gente vai tentar aqui ao máximo, né, traduzir aqui para o professor Paulo, para que ele possa, né, responder e dar o ponto de vista dele. Tá certo, gente? Muito obrigado e vamos a um bom evento.
Então, boa noite novamente a todos. Uma alegria enorme ver vocês aqui, o interesse por essa palestra. Eu sou a Andrea Hoffman, para quem ainda não me conhece. Estou no board, no Conselho da Brasil Law and Liberty Society. Então, aqui em Brasília, sou o ponto de contato. Fico muito feliz assim, de ver tantas caras que eu não conheço, né, e que eu tenho a oportunidade de conhecer também. Eu queria fazer um agradecimento muito especial, né, aos apoiadores e patrocinadores desse evento aqui hoje. Então, Então, primeiro, a própria Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie, né? Professora Kátia, muito obrigada. Professor Rodolfo, através do laboratório, né? Muito obrigada. Professora Eneida, eu tenho que fazer um agradecimento especial, porque tive uma alegria de reencontrá-la alguns anos depois, porque ela esteve na minha banca de monografia, nem chamava TCC, gente, na minha época, monografia do curso da graduação de Direito, alguns aninhos atrás. E queria fazer um agradecimento especial também ao Dr. Eduardo Gaban, do Nishioca e Gaban Advogados, que é um dos patrocinadores aqui desse evento, também ao Instituto Ives Granda e ao Instituto Isabel, que também são apoiadores, né? Então, a gente, de forma também ainda mais especial, a gente agradece ao professor Paulo Carozza por ter, de forma tão generosa, disponibilizado o seu tempo para estar aqui conosco, né? Então, a gente agradece também a Mariana Brito, que está fazendo a tradução desse evento hoje, né? Então, espero que vocês possam compreender bem também. Vou falar só um pouquinho rapidamente, antes de passar a palavra para o professor Paulo, sobre o que é a Brasil Law and Liberty Society, né? Realmente, como o professor Rodolfo falou, é uma instituição recém-criada, né? A gente está com bases em Brasília e em São Paulo, e iniciando o primeiro círculo aqui no Mackenzie, em conjunto com o laboratório, né? Então, é uma organização, uma ONG, sem fins lucrativos, é apartidária, foi constituída no Brasil, né? E é dedicada à defesa dos princípios necessários para a manutenção de uma sociedade livre, tais como o governo constitucional ilimitado, os direitos individuais, a separação de poderes e a subsidiariedade. E o objetivo é criar um espaço onde advogados, formuladores de políticas públicas, estudantes de direito, né, economistas, enfim, e outras partes interessadas possam aprender e discutir temas contemporâneos nas áreas de direito, políticas públicas, sociedade, que são de importância existencial para a preservação de uma sociedade livre no Brasil. Então, por meio da organização de eventos presenciais, online, entrevistas, palestras, mesas redondas, a ideia é que possamos reunir especialistas em suas áreas para que sejam abertos a se envolver com essas ideias que são instigantes e desafiadoras, né, ao seu público ali. Então, apesar do nosso trabalho ser focado principalmente em estudantes de direito, né, ou pessoas, advogados, gente da área jurídica, os nossos valores e missão podem atrair também pessoas que têm ideias semelhantes, mas são de diversas áreas, né? A gente tem alguns voluntários, inclusive engenheiro mecatrônico, então, realmente podemos acolher a todos que estejam interessados nessas questões. Então, a Brasil Law and Liberty Society tem orgulho de fazer parte de uma rede internacional, que é a International Law and Liberty Society, onde são mais de 20 países que têm círculos como esse que a gente está inaugurando aqui no país também. Então, advogados e estudantes de direitos compartilham desses mesmos valores e se reúnem em mais de 20 países. E também a gente gosta de esclarecer que a Brasil Law and Liberty Society não assume posições oficiais sobre questões jurídicas ou políticas e também não endossa partidos políticos, né? A nossa iniciativa é estritamente educacional, formativa, mas os nossos membros, obviamente, são incentivados a exercer os seus direitos políticos como cidadãos responsáveis que devemos ser. Então, eu quero fazer agora uma introdução ao professor Paulo Carozza, é professor de Direito e de Ciência Política na Universidade de Notre. Quem não conhece a Universidade de Notre, eu indico muito buscar, procurar, né, depois que vocês saírem aqui da graduação, dar uma olhada nos cursos de pós-graduação especialmente. Seu trabalho acadêmico tem se concentrado em Direito Constitucional Comparado e Direito dos Direitos Humanos, com ênfase nos princípios fundamentais dos direitos humanos. Na Universidade de Notre Dame, dirigiu o Instituto Kellogg de Estudos Internacionais durante 10 anos. Além da academia, atuou em várias instituições dedicadas aos direitos humanos e ao Estado de Direito, incluindo como presidente da Comissão Interamericana de Direitos Humanos, membros dos Estados Unidos, da Comissão Europeia para a Democracia e pelo Direito, Comissão de Veneza e da Comissão de Direitos Inalienáveis do Departamento de Estado dos Estados Unidos. Atualmente, é co-presidente do Conselho de Supervisão, um órgão independente criado pela Meta Platforms, para tomar decisões e fazer recomendações sobre problemas difíceis de moderação de conteúdo. É membro da Pontifícia Academia de Ciências Sociais e da Academia Americana de Ciências e Letras e foi professor visitante em várias outras universidades nos Estados Unidos, Europa e América do Sul. Então, vou deixar aqui o palco para o professor Paulo Carozza. Espero que vocês aproveitem muito e muito obrigada novamente. Professor. The floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm very sorry that I can't address you in Portuguese. I regret it very much. I wish I could. Thank you, Andrea, for that kind introduction. And thank you all, my hosts at Mackenzie and Law and Liberty, for this wonderful opportunity to be with you this evening. I'm going to offer just a few minutes of opening remarks here to frame our conversation a bit, but I will intentionally be very brief with them so that then we can have a dialogue a little bit more. It's an honor to be invited to address the Brazil Law and Liberty Society. I've had the privilege of speaking at other law and liberty events in other parts of the world, such as Poland and the United Kingdom. One of the reasons that I find it appealing to do so is that the presence of law and liberty groups discussing vital questions of public life in such diverse places affirms both the universality of fundamental values that can unite us across time and space, but also the important differences among us that shape each legal and constitutional context in their own ways. All of us desire authentic freedom for ourselves and desire the common good for the communities to which we belong. No matter where we live, the rule of law has an essential role to play in securing that liberty and that common good in a unique way that no other institution, no other human institution can achieve. And yet, those universal principles and institutions need to be realized, need to be made concrete and effective and brought to life in widely differing contexts. The history, social needs, and fundamental cultural orientations of Brazil are not the same as those in Poland or the United Kingdom or the United States. The liberty of a people is exercised in fundamental part exactly by determining for themselves, including in particular through their institutions and practices of law, which aims to prioritize over others, how to allocate their resources, how to harmonize the diverse interests and activities of their society to serve the common good of all. That vision that I just articulated corresponds to the original ideal of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in my estimation still remains one of the greatest achievements of the human conscience in the modern world. To borrow and adapt a metaphor from Jacques Maritain, the French philosopher and diplomat who played a vital role in the creation and adoption of the Universal Declaration. The 30 articles of the Declaration are like musical instruments. Each one expresses a unique and essential sound, and the harmonious unity of them all is vital to the beauty and integrity of the music that results from the score. But every society will use the 30 instruments to play its music differently, in a new key, in a distinctive rhythm and tempo, a unique melody. The samba is not American jazz or a Polish polka, and yet each of these represents a certain harmony having its own creative genius and beauty. I've spent over 3 decades now, over half my life, seeking to understand and to promote that creative and essential tension between universality and particularity. It has been the persistent question at the heart of my work in human rights and comparative constitutionalism, both in the university and in the variety of different institutional settings in which I have had the privilege to serve. While the universal principles and ideals of constitutionalism, including the rule of law and the protection of human rights, can and should guide our common commitment to liberty, constitutions also represent, par excellence, each society's need for self-governance, its need to set its own basic norms and to craft its own institutions of public life. Thus, we can and should understand and embrace the distinctiveness of our separate traditions, even while we have regard for universal norms, and while we learn from the constitutional experiences of other countries. The universality of rights does not mean uniformity in law. This truth is as present and vital to an institution dedicated to advancing democracy and the rule of law through constitutionalism, the Venice Commission, as it is in a regional human rights framework like the Inter-American System of Human Rights. It was also the core intuition of the much misunderstood United States Commission on Unalienable Rights, on which I served when it was convened in 2019 and 20 by the then US Secretary of State. That commission, a diverse and nonpartisan group, had two main aims. First, to reaffirm that a commitment to international human rights should continue to be central to US foreign policy. And second, at the same time, to root that commitment in the distinctive character and value of the US constitutional tradition and the great ideals that still inspire it. The goal was not to undermine the universality of human rights, but exactly the opposite, to reaffirm that the universality of human rights necessarily has to be realized through and take account of each constitutional culture's uniqueness. The final report of that commission was not a narrow assertion of United States superiority, but rather an invitation for other peoples around the world to do the same, to examine and bring out the ways in which a common global commitment to human dignity, liberty, and the rule of law could be brought to life through the particular traditions and ideals embodied in their own legal and constitutional histories and identities. By doing so, we will all add to both the genuine universality of human rights and also to the rich and valuable diversity of the human family. This brings me directly to the more specific topic of the title that has been given to our dialogue for tonight. Next year marks the 250th anniversary, excuse me, of the United States Declaration of Independence. And our Constitution and its Bill of Rights are nearly as old. In that long tradition of law, as I'm sure you all know, the United States is famously exceptional when it comes to the protection of freedom of speech, in ways that lie at the heart of global debates around freedom of expression today, including very prominently here in Brazil. In many of the most controversial areas of contemporary public life, hateful speech, misinformation, and the criticism of public figures, for example, United States law tends to be significantly more protective of speech than that of many other constitutional traditions. Even when put under great stress, as is currently the case in the United States, and not for the first time in our history, we have been resilient in limiting the power of the state to control what our citizens can say or what information they should receive, and allowing even deeply unpopular points of view, the freedom to be heard. Now, I am a strong advocate of that robust understanding of the importance and centrality of free speech and of its constraints on public authorities. Freedom of speech is among the most fundamental of human rights, not only because of its role in allowing us to express ourselves as individuals. It is essential to democratic life and to the possibility of dialogue and reason and persuasion. Above all, it corresponds deeply to the elementary structure of the human person as a social animal who needs relationships and community in order to flourish, and who relies on language to form and maintain those relationships. At the same time, we must be realistic in recognizing that the online information ecosystem today presents us with historically unprecedented challenges to freedom of expression. The scale of social media and other information technologies is vastly greater than anything we have previously experienced. Speech circulates with astonishing speed and with a global reach that routinely ignores borders and sovereignties. The technologies that power the platforms carrying this expression harness human psychology to command our attention and to amplify the power and effect of the messages conveyed. And all of that global power is alarmingly concentrated, with private companies exercising extensive control over the dynamics of the spaces in which our communication unfolds. Meta platforms alone is unquestionably the largest speech regulator in the history of the human race. Think about it. To honor human dignity, both our own and that of others, to maintain all of our law and liberties, human rights also come with responsibilities. Freedom of expression is no exception. For public authorities, it is the responsibility to respect and protect an open and free communicative environment. For you and me as citizens, it is the responsibility to use our precious freedom to seek the truth, to serve the common good, and to expand the scope of human reason and knowledge. And for the private entities with such extraordinary power over our communications, it is the responsibility to make their power accountable, to maintain their platforms as open environments governed by fair and transparent rules equally applied, and to prevent their tools from being used to perpetrate violence, fraud, and exploitation. Now, how we reconcile these competing values is an exceedingly difficult but urgent question. Even more difficult is figuring out how to do so on a global scale in a way that both respects the universality of the right to freedom of expression and also allows every people to govern themselves and to adapt universal principles to their local realities. There are no easy answers to these challenges, and so I look forward to discussing them with you this evening. Thank you.
So, Professor, thank you very much for your opening remarks. Now we are going to make, Andrea and I, we are going to make some questions, and in the end we are going to listen to some questions from our audience. Tá, pessoal? Então, quem quiser depois pode começar a formular perguntas. A Camille vai aparecer daqui a pouquinho, tá? A gente vai tentar depois também selecionar algumas para apresentar aqui, né, para o professor. So, Professor, let's start with the basics. And what is freedom of expression, and is it considered such a cornerstone for any well-functioning democracy?
Is it working? Okay. Thank you, Adolfo, for the question. As I indicated in my opening remarks, I do believe quite firmly that freedom of expression is essential to democratic life, precisely in order to be able to make an encounter among people possible, to establish relationships that are based on reason, on persuasion, not just on power, not just on force, not just on interest. Democracy only functions with a certain kind of openness to ideas, to others, with a certain kind of tolerance of ideas that we don't like, and listening. Anything that closes an intellectual environment down is a threat to democracy. And it makes it harder to establish the kinds of relationships that can maintain peace, stability, cooperation, and the progress and innovation and dynamism that comes from it. So for all of these reasons, freedom of expression has rightly always been regarded as not just an important right, but one of the fundamental cornerstones to democratic life.
Very good, very good. Thank you. And I will make just another question, then we'll pass to Andrea. In your opening remarks, you spoke about the universality of human rights. At the same time, different legal traditions attribute different weights to certain rights. For instance, according to the report on unalienable rights, I will quote here, the high value the United States has accorded to freedom of speech has led Washington to take exception of international norms mandating the prohibition of hate speech, end quote. Compared to most countries, the scope of freedom of expression guaranteed under the First Amendment in the United States Constitution is quite ampliative. Could you talk, please, about the question whether or not there is a hierarchy in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and why does the US attribute so much weight to freedom of expression?
Thank you. Those are two questions, both important. Let me talk about the hierarchy question first. In a certain sense, the Universal Declaration establishes no hierarchy among the human rights that it lists. They are all important to human dignity. They're all ways of specifying in detail what respect for human dignity requires. And so it is necessary to try to realize all of the rights in order to honor the dignity of human persons and the communities they live in. And so there's a unity to it, and the document is intended to be read as a unified document. Anything that takes the rights of the Universal Declaration and fragments them and separates them from one another does violence to the underlying idea that it represents. Human dignity is a single thing. It doesn't exist in fragments. And so rights are just some way of protecting something that has a fundamental unity to it, just as a human person. I'm not two people, you're not three people. I mean, I don't know, maybe, but but if you were, we would consider that would be, something to be, to be worried about, right? So just as there is a unity to the human person, there's a human to human dignity, there's a unity to rights, right? And yet, at the same time, of course, if serving the common good means trying to realize all the rights, it's impossible to maximize all of the rights all of the time because they relate to all of the other rights. Right? So there necessarily, in practice, must be trade-offs. There must be ways of harmonizing rights, of limiting, drawing lines, and limiting the relationship of one right to another right. And that, exactly that, in that relationship among rights, is where different societies will draw the lines differently. Sometimes because their values are a little bit different. Just to take a very high level of generality, some traditions are much more communitarian in orientation and value social harmony much more. Others are much more libertarian in their orientation and value individual freedom much more. Those different societies will draw the lines between freedom of expression and social harmony in different ways. And in that tradition, the United States, to come to the second question now, has always had an exceptionally strong view about how to distinguish and harmonize freedom of expression relative to other rights. Now, why? Well, in part, there's just a historical inheritance that we have. But I think an important part, which is often overlooked, to the United States' insistence on a very strong form of freedom of expression, is our own historical experience. The First Amendment has been there for almost 250 years. First Amendment is that part of the Constitution that protects, that says, Congress, the legislature, shall make no law regarding freedom of speech, right? That's a very strong statement. And the 250 years since then, the 2.5 centuries of law and constitutional development on this question is almost like an extended meditation on the value of freedom of speech. There have been various threats to freedom of expression during those centuries in the United States. There have been various temptations to restrict it. And historical experience has taught us that it is better to maintain a society of openness and tolerance, even to the ideas that we don't like. Primarily because the restriction today of the idea that I don't like is a restriction that tomorrow will become a restriction on my own ideas. And so I'm willing to protect and to embrace and to allow even the idea that I find quite hateful, even an idea that I find quite outrageous, in order to protect an environment in which freedom will be maintained over time.
Thank you, Professor. Your opening remarks were very inspiring. Thank you for that. So I'd like to ask you, in 2017, a group of European scholars, including Roger Scruton, Rémi Brague, Pierre Monin, published a manifesto titled A Europe We Can Believe In, whereby they laid out a vision for Europe grounded on the historical heritage of the continent. One of the points they addressed was the rise of populism. According to the document, and I quote, "Still, we acknowledge that much is this new political phenomenon can represent a healthy rebellion against the tyranny of the false Europe, which labels as anti-democratic any threat to its monopoly on moral legitimacy. The so-called populism challenges the dictatorship of the status quo, the fanatism of the center, and highly so. It is a sign that even in the midst of our degraded and impoverished political culture, the historical agency of the European peoples can be born. Populism should be engaged." end quote. Since then, we witnessed the rise of more populist leaders, not only in Europe, but also in Latin America, including Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, Javier Milei in Argentina, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, more recently, Zoran Mandami in New York City. So the question is, do populist parties from either side of the political parties have a legitimate space in a democratic society and should enjoy freedom of expression? If they do, what should the legal parameters of that should be?
You very kindly did not mention my president, who should be added to the list.
I still want to go to Disney World.
The word populism is a word that's used in so many different ways today. It's a word to be very careful about. Because people aren't talking about necessarily the same things when they talk about populism. So let me try to be careful, at least in the way that I'm going to use it. Insofar as, and I think this is the way that Manon and Scruton and others were using it in this statement. Insofar as populism represents an appeal to the will of the people that is more direct rather than mediated through traditional political institutions, like political parties, for example, and established mechanisms. I'm convinced that there not only is a space that must be given to that meaning of populism, and I'll come back to other meanings, but in fact, it's vitally important, precisely because it can be the case. Historically, we have ample examples, not just recent ones, where politics can become the practices of elites that do not serve the common good of the people. And when that situation persists and becomes entrenched and becomes sclerotic, right, hard to change, then one expects a reaction. And to shut it down completely because populism is bad, in a broad label, does a certain violence to democracy, to the capacity of the people to be heard, to be self-governing. The particular rise of populist politics in so many parts of the world today, in my country and in yours and in Europe, as you mentioned, and elsewhere, it doesn't come from nowhere. So the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, what has given rise to it? Is it simply because, whatever, Facebook results in polarization and direct appeals? No. I mean, that has its role to play as well, right? But there are also genuine human needs and concerns that are fueling these sorts of reactions. We have to be attentive to those. And to close politics in such a way that makes it difficult to articulate those needs, to try to respond to them, is something that, in the end, I think will only backfire and make democracy even more precarious. So yes, there needs to be room. Now, here's the other side of the coin, in my view. I mentioned in my opening remarks a strong emphasis on the need for law, a strong emphasis on the need for institutions. I value greatly the work that I did at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, at the Venice Commission, which was all about building strong institutions of the rule of law. The temptation of populism, of many instances of populist politics today, is not simply to appeal directly to a certain voice of the people, but to do so in a way that is directly, sometimes intentionally, aimed at destroying in the long term the institutions of the rule of law. And then when we do that, what will protect us? Right? What will protect us in the future when the power that is concentrated turns around and wants to eat us? So that has to be the limit. I'm not opposed to populist politics. I think they have a vital role to play in the dynamics of democracy. But we need to be strong in respecting and maintaining the institutions of the rule of law as a guide to work within. And in the long run, that will serve all of us better.
Thank you.
Very deep thoughts. Now, we have many questions here from the audience, very good ones. We'll try to follow what.
Feel free.
Yeah, then
any
maybe
point.
even. But unlike the Council of Europe commissioned a report in 2016 titled "Information Disorder." In it, the authors called for a joint effort of governments, civil society, and tech companies to tackle misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, the three common expressions. To my knowledge, this report was the first instance in which an international organization uses those terms in an official document. Reports, resolutions, and other non-binding documents come under the umbrella of soft law. Since then, multiple countries either implemented or are in the process of passing laws that establish for tech companies the duty to remove content that might be considered harmful or misinformation, as Brazil. Could you comment on the impact that soft law may have in changing our understanding of freedom of expression and interpretation by the courts?
Yes, let's take two steps. First, the question of misinformation and other things that you mentioned, and then we can ask, is there a proper role of soft law? I'll be honest, or I'll say up front, I don't like the term soft law at all, because it's not law. And so it's a contradiction in terms. I say that as an international lawyer, where there's a lot of so-called soft law in the air, but I'll come back to that. We all know that the online space is full of false information, right? I have children. I imagine many of you do, right? Every day I hear from them things that are asserted as fact that I know to be false, right? It's astonishing. And it worries me, right? It worries me because I ask, how will they be educated into a proper relationship with reality? How will they grow up knowing how to discern the difference between truth and falsehood and to guide their actions accordingly? So yes, it's a problem. Right? But how we respond to that problem requires a lot of nuance and care and discipline in thinking. Because it's not just one problem, it's a combination of different problems. So take something like disinformation. Right? If we understand the word disinformation properly, I would define it as a systematic and intentional effort to sow false information for harmful purposes. Right? So I intentionally create bot farms that flood a space, often in a foreign country, with false information, specifically with the intention of trying to undermine the political system or the economic system, to sow dissent, to create violence, to undermine democracy. If that's what we mean, and that's what we should mean by disinformation, then absolutely it should be prohibited. And there need to be very active forms, and there are very active forms of intervention and cooperation between public authorities and platforms to try to halt that and to stop it, right? Every day, every week, every month, you see reports coming out of Meta and other platforms of the dismantling of systematic campaigns of disinformation that are being run out of places like China and Russia and Iran. Right? That's a fact. That's not an ideological statement. That's just a fact. How we respond to something like disinformation or even malinformation is a very different question. First of all, because what counts as disinformation or malinformation is much more ambiguous. If we disagree about some fundamental facts, right, you might regard what I'm saying as misinformation and vice versa, but who is to be the judge? First of all, who's to be the judge? Think of all of the controversies we had in my country and yours and around the world over the responses to the COVID pandemic, for example. Many of the things that were being offered for consumption in the online space were in fact false, and some of them even dangerous, right? Supposed COVID cures that actually would cause harm in a direct way. But many of the things that were labeled as misinformation during that time have proved to be much less certainly false. The effectiveness of lockdowns, for example, right? Or masks, or the origin of the virus. These are things that require public debate in order to respond to them. Even if there is misinformation there, the most adequate response is more information, is more public debate, is more transparency, not removal of the information. To remove information that is importantly needed for public debate and public decision only makes the situation worse, right? And so I'm very, very reluctant to legitimate the kinds of public interventions that would require platforms to remove what is labeled as misinformation and still less malinformation. We need more truth. The truth of things emerges primarily by responding to falsehood, not by trying to suppress it, right? So now the question of soft law. I mean, there are two ways of responding to it. As I already indicated in the first sentence, I said, I think that debate within political institutions and academic institutions around fundamental norms is essential. I often participate in them. I'm involved in institutions that create statements about what we think the norms should be and how they should develop. I'm in no way opposed to that. On the contrary, I think that's very helpful to democratic life and to the protection of rights. The work that I do now on the Oversight Board, which I think we'll talk about more in a few minutes, is such a thing. It's not an institution of law. We issue decisions and recommendations in a public way. We argue over norms of human rights that apply to freedom of expression. I deeply hope that what we do there influences the way that people think about the accountability of platforms and responsibility and how to protect human rights. But I don't regard it as law, and I don't want to regard it as law. Law properly comes from institutions that have democratic accountability, right? And so there's a difference between hard law, real law, and the kinds of things that contribute to public discussion, but should not be the basis for making formal decisions in the public sphere by themselves.
Perfect. Now, as you asked, we are going to discuss questions related to digital law, thinking about internet, meta, and everything related. In 2016, again, now going to Great Britain, they held a referendum on whether or not they should stay in the European Union, the Brexit. To the surprise of many, the Brits decided by a small margin to leave. For many analysts, Brexit was the first time that social media and messaging apps played a vital role in influencing the result of an election. Now, Professor, what do you think that the main challenges introduced by social media and messaging apps were for regulating speech online? And how different are the legal and regulatory landscapes now compared to 15 years ago?
Let's start at the end. They're radically, 15 years ago they didn't exist, right? More to the point, they're completely different now than 5 years ago, right? 5 years ago, there was almost no regulation. What you're referring to in 2016 with Brexit, or with the United States election, which was, shall we say, a surprise to many of us, there was no regulation of any kind, really, of any meaningful kind of social media. Today, everywhere, heavily in Brazil, as you know much better than I, in the European Union, much less in the United States, for reasons we could come back to if people are interested. In India, in Kenya, Nigeria. I mean, you go around the world and regulations exist in many places. In fact, if anything today, the multiplicity of regulations is creating a whole different set of problems because they're not coordinated with one another. Many of those are premised on a belief that the dynamics of social media negatively affects politics and democratic life. I'm convinced that is the case. It does, or it has. I don't deny that. I'm worried about it. But it's extremely difficult to trace in the literature and in the studies and the observation exactly what the causal effects are. What is the causal mechanism? What exactly is it about social media that has an effect on democracy and political debate? The research is very, very mixed. It's very complicated. It's very hard to trace. And so how to respond to it is still, I think, should remain a deeply open question, subject to a lot of debate, subject to further examination, to very tentative responses, because the danger is that by overreacting on one theory that may prove to be questionable, there will be unintended consequences as well. And in particular, I think, at least what I'm seeing in the literature that I follow in this area, and I try to because of the work that I'm doing, one of the much of the polarization and hostility that is generated and that is visible in the social media space is fostered by cultural and social and political conditions that exist outside of the digital media space, right? So we have to be careful not to put too much causation, although I think there's some, I'm not denying it, just on the platforms. And by doing so, ignoring the questions at a more fundamental social and cultural level about what's dividing us, what is preventing us from reaching political compromises, what is preventing us from establishing new forms of cooperation over intractable social problems, right? to put it in a different way, in a very concrete way, much of the literature shows that those among us who are most likely to be susceptible to extremist online speech, to be radicalized online, are people who, in their offline life, have much fewer social connections, who are much more isolated, who live in virtual worlds and don't live tangibly in relationship with their neighbors, with their colleagues, with other students, right? That's not just a problem of the online world. That's a human problem of the absence of genuine human connections and relationships. So the problem of the relationship between the online world and democracy has to be addressed also at the level of the communities we live in. Are we living real relationships with our neighbors? Do we talk to people we disagree with on a daily basis? Right? If we do, then the online world will be less problematic than it is.
That's it. As a friend of mine says, be friends with your neighbors. So we have another question. Once again, quoting the report of Unalienable Rights. We recently seen disturbing examples of some states employing their public health responsibilities during the COVID-19 pandemic to justify excessive restrictions on freedom of the press and freedom of expression and the arbitrary detention of human rights advocates. With new technological breakthroughs, the agency of internet users is expanded, while at the same time, governments have a more sophisticated surveillance apparatus to control and punish its citizens. Could you please share with us your thoughts on this double-edged sword situation? You kind of already answered, but if you could add something else.
Sure. So again, this is a complex, wonderful question. Complex because it unites different problems together. I'll say first with regard to the question of, for example, health misinformation, COVID, and so forth. This is where the rule of law matters. The institutions of law matter. There's a long jurisprudence, there's a long history, there's a rich, sophisticated way of understanding the scope, how to protect the right to freedom of expression. Not just in the First Amendment to the United States, but in international human rights law. Again, as we'll come to eventually at the oversight board, the norms that we use in order to apply standards to Meta and Meta's platforms are derived from the standards of international human rights law. Right? Principally, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and Article 19, which protects freedom of expression, and Article 19.3, which says these are the strict conditions under which freedom of expression can be limited. There are principles and norms of law there that can be applied. When you apply them faithfully, then it's clear that yes, there can be public restrictions, legitimate public restrictions on speech in order to protect public health, but there has to be a direct, immediate connection to imminent harm. That's what the law says. That's what the jurisprudence says. So you can't restrict it simply to say, well, there might be harm, right? We're taking a precautionary approach. We'll restrict speech in order because, there's a risk. A risk isn't enough, right? That's the problem that emerged with the panic of COVID. And I understand the panic. I panicked as well as everybody else when we didn't know what was happening. So in emergency situations, it's often the case that people overreact, that governments overreact. That's always been the case in every emergency. That's why there are also special norms that limit emergencies in international human rights law and states of emergency. But now let's try to evaluate it with a little bit more calm, right? And we can see that there were many overreactions precisely that violated this principle of human rights law that says the harm must be immediate and direct. Right? The second part of the question was, now I've forgotten.
With the new technological breakthroughs.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, new technological breakthroughs. Wow. Well, I mean, I'm not quite sure what to say other than I'm quite terrified by the implications of the surveillance state. The extent to which the state can and does in many parts of the world, and we know the principal examples, but not only, is alarming. And it's not simply because everything is now being observed, but because the data that's being harvested is capable of being used through the computing power, essentially, for predictive purposes in ways that can be used to control human behavior in a way that we've never seen before. Right? So it's the information that's being gathered. Here, the concern is intimately related also to the development and deployment and the responsible limitation of use of artificial intelligence mechanisms. And that's a danger that I think is present everywhere in the world. Yeah.
I have to live with that.
So, Professor, I have received many questions about the meta oversight. I think that's now time to, if it's possible, to explain to everyone here how it works, and how is the relation between the oversight with meta, if there is any kind of influence or not, if it's independent, and if you can mention some cases, important cases that you have decided that.
Sure. Yeah, there are many cases that are worth talking about, but let me give a short thumbnail overview of the institution. The Oversight Board was created 5 years ago by Meta, and the timing is important. I mentioned a moment ago, 5 years ago, the regulatory environment was completely different, and it was. Meta had then, at that point, been subject rightly to a variety of very severe criticisms about the ways in which its platforms had been used, even in situations that were directly related to very grave human rights violations, genocide, okay, to put it, not a fine point on it. In that context, Meta decided that it could benefit from having an independent board of experts that would be charged with making decisions about content that could be removed or that should remain on Meta's platforms. Right? So the worry both was, is there harmful content that should be removed, but also to do so in a way that will protect freedom of expression. The charter of the board, the first line of the charter of the board says that the Oversight Board exists to protect freedom of expression. Right? That's our fundamental mandate. Now, in order to do so, we also have to decide the proper limits of freedom of expression. One protects the right also by understanding what the appropriate scope of the right is. Okay? And so we receive cases from users, you who are if you use Facebook or Threads or Instagram, and your content is taken down, or if you object to someone else's content, and you don't like Meta's response to your appeal to Meta, you can appeal that decision to us. We select among those cases that come to us, and we make decisions that Meta has contractually bound itself to implement. So they're binding on Meta as a matter of contract. When we make a decision, say this content has to stay up, this content to stay down. It's binding on Meta, and in every case that we've done it for 5 years, Meta has implemented our decisions, even though at last count, probably about 3/4 of our decisions, about 75%, have overturned Meta's decisions initially, right? So it's quite significant, and I think quite a significant testimony to our independence. Independence is key to the board. It would not exist. Frankly, I wouldn't be a member of it. None of my colleagues would be members of it if we weren't assured of the guarantees of independence of it. That independence is principally ensured by the fact that Meta has taken all of the money to finance the board and put it in an independent trust that is irrevocable, so they can't touch that money. And that trust money is governed by independent trustees who are not appointed or accountable to Meta. And they fund us. Meta can't remove me if they don't like a decision that I've made. They can't. We select future members of the board. Meta doesn't. So these are all guarantees of independence. The board consists of 21, currently 21. It might grow a little bit in the coming months. Members from all over the world. And 6 of us are from the United States only. The rest of the 21 are from all different countries, including Latin America, 1 from Brazil. And more importantly, they come from all different professional backgrounds. Lawyers, politicians, a former prime minister, digital activist who's a former Nobel Peace Prize winner, people who are editors of major global newspapers, etc. And lastly, but critically, it's a very diverse group in terms of viewpoints, deliberately gathered to represent a wide variety of political, ideological, religious, ethical perspectives. But all of us with a common commitment to debating these things, reasoning with one another, trying to reach these decisions. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll go to give you some examples of the cases, because this is really where the board, I think, has its greatest value, is not in the individual decisions we make over pieces of content. I mean, there are 3 billion pieces of content every day. We're making decisions over 50 pieces of content a year. Okay, the scale is unimaginably different. So it's not really that decision that matters. It's the fact that in connection with that decision, policy decisions are made that affect the content across all of the platforms in a variety of other ways. So in every case, we make recommendations to Meta about its content policies. What are the rules? How should the rules be changed? How are they enforced? How is automation used? What is the algorithms, how are they deployed in order to enforce the decisions, and what are the penalties associated with them? And those recommendations, although they're not binding on Meta in the way that the specific decision is, can have a very broad impact on the platforms. Again, Meta has implemented at least 1/3 of about 250 of the recommendations that we've made, and many of those have resulted in very substantial changes to the rules that are applied on the platforms and the way those rules are enforced and the transparency with which they're enforced. So to give you just one recent example, I'll choose an interesting case exactly from Brazil. Brazil's a fantastic environment for generating cases for the Oversight Board. It's such a rich online environment, so many people online, so many people active, many people who appeal to us constantly, so we love Brazil. We love Brazilians because there's so many great cases that come from Brazil. But the most recent one that we decided had to do with a scam, a fraud that was being perpetrated through the use of artificial intelligence and the generation of a deep fake. And what happened was there was a post that was attracting people to a fraudulent online gambling site. And it was doing so by using a deep fake generated endorsement by the soccer player, the Brazilian soccer player Ronaldo. Right? And so we took this case in part because looking at it, we realized that we thought that Meta's enforcement in the area of online scams and frauds had something that was fundamentally problematic about it. And in fact, what we found in the case is that because Ronaldo's a very important figure, he has many followers online, maybe some of you in this room, Meta was very hesitant to enforce its own rules in that case, because they were afraid that maybe it would over-enforce against a prominent public figure like that. And because it was not enforcing properly its own rules, it was allowing content to remain on the platform that was pulling many other users into a fraudulent scheme, and so allowing fraud to be perpetrated. So we recommended different enforcement practices, different labeling practices of online, of AI manipulated images like were being used there. And those recommendations are now being examined and implemented by Meta in order to improve the practices. That's one example.
A very famous one. And now, Professor, I received some questions that are related to a recent Supreme Court decision in Brazil. So in June...
Which I'm probably not competent to speak about,
yeah.
But okay.
But let's try to make it clear so you can give your opinion. So in June 26, the Supreme Court of Brazil ruled on a case having to do with the interpretation of Article 19 of the Brazilian Internet Legal Framework. It's called Marco Civil da Internet. In summary, the Supreme Court ruled that social media platforms can be held liable if they fail to remove unlawful third-party content after extrajudicial notification. Extrajudicial. Previously, platforms would only be liable after receiving a court order, a judicial order. Like the UK case, the United Kingdom case, platforms are expected to exercise a preventive duty of care. So could you please share with us how you think Meta and maybe other platforms will react to this shift and the incentives such ruling may produce in users and also in tech companies?
Well, let me start by saying I don't speak for Meta, okay? I don't work for Meta. I just affirmed. The Oversight Board is independent from Meta, and so I don't know how they're going to respond. And I don't know this case. I have not read the decision. I would not presume to weigh in on a judgment about Brazilian law. That's not my role. But I'll make a few general comments that may be helpful here. First of all, imposing liability on platforms as intermediaries. They are intermediaries, right? We create the content, we put the speech out there, the expression, they carry it. Sometimes they amplify it, sometimes they take it down, they influence it, there's no question, but they're not creating it, we're creating it. A system of liability that is overly broad, we'll come back to whether this one is such of it, but the broader the system of liability is and the more direct, the more the basic economic incentives of the platforms is going to be to over-enforce their rules, to take down any speech that might make them liable. So it will have stricter liability, easier forms of liability, will have a negative impact on freedom of expression. I don't think there's any doubt about that, right? Platforms will take down speech that otherwise should be left up, that should be allowed, that should contribute to public debate in order to avoid liability. Part of the reason that they'll do that in broad liability systems, and maybe this is applicable to the court's case and judgment there, is that it's not always clear what counts as illegal information, right? Who's defining that? Especially if it's not a judicial order. Who's defining that it violates the law or not? It's one thing if what the platform is doing is facilitating a terrorist attack, right? It's a very different thing if I say something about you because we're in a public dispute together, and you insist that it be taken down as defamation, or even worse. Let's take a real case, okay? Let's take a recent case from Germany. I'll just say, Brazil aside, I'm very worried about what's happening in Europe on the whole front of freedom of expression, right? And it's a good example of how over-enforcement is leading to a closure of the public space, right? So you're a politician, let's say. I don't like you, I'm opposed to you, I think you're making bad decisions. And so I put something on the platform, on my Facebook page, that refers to you, I won't use the word, but refers to you by reference to a vulgar part of the male anatomy. Okay? In Germany, when that happened recently, the person who did that was arrested. Arrested. It's not just that the content came down, he was arrested for having used language so offensive in describing a public figure, a politician with whom he disagreed. That to me is fundamentally beyond the limits of democratic discourse, to use the law to shut down that kind of discourse. That's the kind of speech that will come down because of the ambiguities about, well, what's illegal, what should be allowed, right? If it's too broad. There will be unintended consequences, even in a good faith effort to try to constrain that bad speech. And here's the last point then. I don't know this court. I don't know this court's decision. I don't know the judgment. But instinctively, I worry about that kind of a regulatory scheme being imposed by a court, right? It's exactly because these are very complicated regulatory schemes that involve very complex trade-offs. There will be unintended consequences. There are different values to be balanced that I don't think, at least in principle, in general, judges are the right actors to be doing that. That's quintessentially the kind of legal intervention that should be coming from a democratically accountable legislative body.
I tend to agree. So one last question. Finally, another salient freedom emphasized in the American constitutional tradition is freedom of religion. Earlier this year, in a security summit in Munich, Vice President J.D. Vance reprimanded the European leaders for attacks against religious freedom in the continent. We have been seeing many attacks, in Europe especially. He exemplified the issue by talking about the case of Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and veteran who faced charges brought by the British government because he stood in front of an abortion clinic praying silently, which violated the government's new buffer zones law, which criminalizes silent prayer and other actions that could influence a person's decision within 200 meters of an abortion facility. He was issued a penalty of 100 euros and ordered to pay prosecution costs of about 900 euros. Could you comment on the state of freedom of religion in the United States right now and how it is connected to freedom of expression? If you'd comment, I don't know if you could comment something on Charlie Kirk's also.
On Charlie Kirk as well. Whoa.
It's very connected to all of this.
It is. Well, I mean, in the United States, I actually think that freedom of religion right now is in a pretty good place. I think our constitutional jurisprudence was very, very confused for quite a long time. Contradictory, internally inconsistent, not well ordered. And I think the Supreme Court over the last 10 years or so has brought a great deal of order and consistency and reaffirmed how central the principle is. And I'll be quick to add, in almost all of the fundamental cases, it has not been a divided court either, right? So the typical divisions between, that are at least stereotypical divisions between conservative justices and liberal justices on the court most often don't apply in our religious liberty cases, right? There's quite a strong, consistent, unified understanding of how central the right is. So I think in general. Now, of course, it's always controversial. I mean, that's why it's protected in the Constitution. But the long history of the United States as a religiously pluralistic country is something that I think, again, I hate to sort of to seem like I'm lionizing the United States. The United States has many, many faults. I'm the first one to recognize it and to criticize my country. I criticize it because I love it. But I do think that the strength of our commitment to freedom of religion is one of the things that we have to offer to the rest of the world as an example. The example of religious pluralism, religious harmony, religious diversity, the flourishing of a variety of religious expressions, the capacity of them to live together and to cooperate are things that are the direct results of the historically rooted commitment to freedom of religion. And it's intimately related to freedom of speech. It is, in the law itself, the First Amendment that I referred to before, both protects freedom of speech and freedom of religion in the same amendment, right? The very first statement of protection of rights protects both of them together. And of course they're intimately related, as the UK case illustrates, right? You can't live a religious faith without expressing it. You live it together with other people. It is, by its nature, as I was saying earlier, a communicative act, a relational experience, right? By definition. And the way in which, vice versa, the way in which religious harmony and compatibility and mutual tolerance can exist is also in part by being very respectful of the differences that others have that I might not like. I may even find quite regressive, right? But I'll defend them. I'll defend their right to not just live that way, but to speak in a way that expresses those beliefs. So I think it's essential, essentially related. And in the United States, I think we have a good example of seeing how they're intertwined in so much of our constitutional law. You do see that. I'll say a few words about Charlie Kirk, as you asked. You do see that exactly in that case, right? For better or for worse, I mean, people loved Charlie Kirk, and he inspired many, many, many young people to enter politics who never would have otherwise. He inspired a great deal of hatred and a great deal of opposition because of the substantive positions he took. That's obvious. Again, it's just stating facts, not expressing a judgment about them. But to me, what is, at the end of the day, fundamentally the most important thing for purposes of our discussion now is two things. Charlie Kirk was motivated to take the positions he did and to go out and speak to people because he was a man of religious faith. It was inseparable from who he was. So you can't just his methods of intervening. But he died with a microphone in his hand. Was he aggressive in doing so? Yeah, right? Was the debate always productive and constructive and leading to more harmony? Probably not. It was sometimes incendiary and confrontational, but it was whether one agrees with him or not, in my view, is exactly that he was killed for talking.
Thank you.
So, Professor, thank you very much. We received many good questions, but we have just more few minutes. But I think this one is a special one. I think it's very intelligent. So we'll take 2 minutes and I will take it just as our final question. Given the new challenges faced by modern society, especially because of cultural and technological changes, what is the importance of studying philosophy, especially the classical tradition, to law students to avoid extreme positivist approach that threatens free speech and the common good? It's a more light question. I think that we can conclude.
Thank you. I love concluding on this question. Thank you for whoever asked this question. It's so. It's a bit. I want to meet you afterwards. It couldn't be more important, right? One of the biggest dangers and temptations that I find working now in the world of technology and increasing the AI and so forth, and this is a recent thing for me, right? I'm not a technologist, right? I came to this 3 years ago. I started working in this field. But now I'm immersed in it completely. And one of the greatest limitations that I find is that it's an environment in which we seem to suffer from a form of historical and cultural amnesia. As if the problems we're living are only new and have never come before. Now, the technology is new, and it creates new kinds of problems. But they're human problems. They're problems of human beings. They're problems that affect human beings. They're problems of the way that human beings act in these environments, the way that human beings use these tools, the way that human reason and freedom is affected by these tools. So if we don't know and don't think about and continue to think about and continue to be educating ourselves and one another in all of the traditions of what it means to be human, what it means to be free, what it means to exercise reason and responsibility, then we'll never be able to face the problems of technology. The technology will become the slaves of technology rather than the users of technology if we forget the past.
Right. So I think that we can now finish. Yeah. Professor.
I'm sorry for all of the other questions that didn't get answered. I would have loved to hear them.
Professor nas perguntas, okay? And Professor, if you could please go to your concluding remarks.
I don't have any concluding remarks. I'm more than happy to take another question if you want. Otherwise, I think what I just said is probably what I would want to conclude with. I think across human rights, across law, not only because of technology, right? The biggest crisis that we face is the crisis of the reduction of what it means to be human. Right? The reduction of the full sort of breadth of human life, of what it means to lead a good life, of what contributes to the flourishing, right? The more that you know we allow the desire for that life to be reduced to simply, you know, the next product that the targeted ad wants me to click on, the more that it will degrade all of the rest of the way that we live together, our democracy, the possibility of law, and our families, and every other way in which that affects our daily life. So I think the question that was posed and the possibility of answering it already is the concluding remark.
Thank you very much. Eu só queria dizer para essa pessoa que trouxe isso, que o estudo da antropologia e da filosofia para o direito são essenciais para você poder entender tudo isso que ele falou aqui para a gente, senão nada vai fazer sentido. E, de fato, enquanto a gente estiver desumanizando nós mesmos, a gente não vai chegar a lugar nenhum. Thank you very much. I think we come out from here, I guess, not only thinking about everything that you answered throughout our questions, but questioning ourselves and other things that will come up. And this is very important. We cannot be the ones that are only receiving and mimetizing everything. We have to understand our reality, and from that, as being social, we I guess we'll live life better in our professions and also the education that they are having here. It was a pleasure for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now, Professor, I will invite Professora Kelly to come here. We have a small gift. And also to Andrea. It's time for the pictures. Let's, please. Obrigado, gente. Tá? Para os alunos que estão liberados, para os convidados, sejam bem-vindos, essa é a nossa casa. A gente vai ter outros eventos, vocês vão ser convidados novamente. Obrigado.
Nossa, apenas as cadeiras extras. Obrigada.